Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Kate and I love poetry. As you can probably tell by my channel name, I adore it. I think it is one of the most incredible things that humans have come up with in our very, very short time on this planet, and I want to share my love of it. I recently had an interaction from my personal Instagram account under a post that said something along the lines of, "You know a poem is good when it makes you sit in the middle of your kitchen floor and scream." And I was looking through the comments to see people recommending amazing poems that made them feel like that, when I saw someone who said, "I don't really get poetry, but I really wish I did. Will someone recommend me some of their favourite poems so that I can get into poetry?" And I am not one to miss an opportunity like that, so I replied to the comment and said, "May I do this?" And the person said yes, and so I asked if I could DM them, and I sent them a lot of very, very long messages going through 10 poems that I would recommend as starter poems for people, and pretty soon that initial comment had 15 other people asking if they could see my list of poems, so I realised this was a more popular thing than I had thought it was, that people really want to get into poetry but they don't know where to start, or at the very least that there are a lot of people who are interested in the favourite poems of people who love poetry. And so I thought I would make a video essentially based on my experience from that interaction of recommending poems to people who don't necessarily understand poetry yet. As much as I think poetry is a beautiful, wonderful thing, I realise that a lot of people don't really gel with it. I think this comes from a lot of different things, but I think first and foremost it comes from this idea that poetry is something you have to get, something that you have to understand, and that either you do or you don't. And that if you don't, it is a mark of your intelligence or your creativity, in that you are unable to understand something so artistic and deeply communicative as a poem. And I completely disagree with this notion. Personally, I think that this idea is rooted deeply in patriarchal and classist and elitist views of intellectualism, that everything has to have meaning and if you don't get it then you're an idiot. And that it is this limiting view of artistry that means so many people don't give it a chance because they think it's just not meant for them or people like them. And I want to challenge that, so I have kept my 10 list of poems the same as the ones I gave to the people that I messaged on Instagram, and I'm gonna go through them. I picked these 10 poems firstly because I love them. All of these are poems that I have read and kept in my personal poetry binder that I have. I will make another video another time on my poetry binder, but these are all poems that I love, very, very simply. Next, I have ranked them on a sort of sliding scale of difficulty, how easily I think they can be understood by someone who doesn't think they understand poetry. Because firstly, anyone can understand a poem, and secondly, you don't have to understand a poem to enjoy it. So I have started with poems that are very easy to understand as a way to maybe give you a confidence boost, to show you that yes, you can understand poetry, because not all poetry is complex like the Romantics or the Modernists or Shakespeare's sonnets. Poetry doesn't have to be difficult and wordy and complicated to be good. And that is another notion I want to challenge. If it makes you feel something, it's good poetry. If you like it, it's good poetry, and that is the basis of my thinking. And in line with my feeling that a lot of people have been put off by poetry because of these patriarchal standards, I have deliberately chosen poems that have been written mostly by women, or by people of colour, or queer people, basically the voices that you don't often see given as good poetry. A lot of classic poetry is written by straight, white men about being straight and white and manly, and that is very simply not what poetry is about. Poetry is about celebrating the human experience, about exploring ideas and thoughts and feelings, and anyone can have feelings and thoughts, not just men. So I have deliberately erased men from my list as much as possible to give you a chance to read things that you might not previously have considered, simply because they won't be talked about as much as the poetry by men. So that was my thought process. Things that are easy to understand, things you can enjoy regardless of whether you understand them. Poems that are by voices you won't have heard before, and very simply, that I love them, so I can talk about them at length. That was the only basis by which I picked these poems. There are so many other poems that I enjoy, but I thought for a beginner's list of poems, these are probably a really good starting point. I will give some extended reading at the end as well if you have, say, read a lot of these already, or once you have read these, if you want to go on to read some other things based on these poems that might also pique your interest, because as you can tell, I can talk at length about poetry for a very long time, and I probably will do in future again. So, I will begin with poem number 1, The Orange by Wendy Cope. This is a very, very simple poem. It is one that I am sure if you have been operating in literary circles on Tumblr and Instagram, or for example in the comment section under that Instagram post I mentioned, you will probably know The Orange. It is what my first tattoo is based on. I have a half orange slice in celebration of it. This is a poem about finding the simple joys of life, about celebrating sharing, about celebrating community, about celebrating just existing and being here. And it is one of those poems that I have memorised because I have just read it so many times, and it is so simple and beautiful. It follows a very, very simple structure. It is 3 stanzas of 4 lines with a very, very simplistic rhyme scheme as well. It also follows, I don't know if it's iambic pentameter, but it follows such a beautiful meter that it feels very, very natural to speak, and I think that is a mark of a truly good poem, is when it looks so simplistic and easy, and yet you can tell that the only reason it looks so simple and easy is because of the amount of thought that has gone into the word choice, the pacing, the choice to end it at only 3 stanzas. I could personally read a 10-page poem going through the beautiful things in life that make you appreciate just being alive, but it was limited just to sharing an orange with some friends and then going for a walk. I think it's so, so lovely. It doesn't take anyone with a huge understanding of poetic technicality to understand what this poem is saying or to appreciate why it is so effective. And I think that is why it is such an excellent poem, and it's why it's the first one I'm suggesting, because it is a beautiful poem, it is an encouraging poem, and anyone can enjoy it. The next poem that I am selecting is Hour by Carol Ann Duffy. Now, as I said that out loud, I realised something beautiful about the poem. It is hour as in time, but when you say it out loud, hour means sharing, me and you, us. This is a sonnet. Now, don't freak out because I said the word sonnet. Sonnets are actually very, very easily read poems. It's just that it's become very tangled up in Shakespeare and Shakespearean language, and so often it sounds very intimidating to learn that something is a sonnet. This is a sonnet about lesbian love. It is a sonnet about having time with the person that you adore and realising that nothing can diminish this time spent with them, that it is eternal and priceless and warm and beautiful. I read this poem actually for the first time in a classroom because during my GCSE exams we were looking at unseen poetry, which is a section of the exam paper, and so we were given random poems to read and then find some thoughts about in terms of the style, what it's saying, the skills and techniques that it uses. But it meant I read this poem in a not particularly romantic setting, but already I was struck by how beautiful it was. Carol Ann Duffy is one of the best known British poets. She was the British Poet Laureate for a good number of years, but she often writes with a huge depth and complexity and ambiguity, and that is why I think this poem is a perfect example of her skill at writing, is because she hasn't put in the ambiguity that she is often known for. It is just straightforward and honest and romantic. I love that she has taken the classical form of a sonnet, which has always been used as a love poem, and instead of making it patriarchal and male-focused, or about the male gaze towards a woman, it is about 2 women rolling around in the sunshine, kissing and enjoying being with each other. I think it is beautiful and I have it on my wall by my desk because I love just looking at poetry, and it makes me happy to have something so beautiful beside me even while I'm working. My next poem is Won't You Celebrate With Me by Lucille Clifton. This is another very, very short, very, very easy poem about black female empowerment, about surviving and thriving and still being here even though the world doesn't want you there. The final line is it's so beautiful, it's so to the point, it's so blunt. And that's another thing that I think goes under-celebrated in poetry, is bluntness. Yes, you can take however long you want to say anything, and often that benefits a poem, but sometimes simplicity is where it's at, and that final sentiment is a punch in the air. It is saying, I will not be defeated, I am here, and I have survived, and you cannot get rid of me. And I think it is an incredible anthem for any minority that has had to look oppression in the face and say, I will not be defeated by you. I think this poem is a battle cry, but more than anything, it is comfort at the end of a fight. It is being with your community once more and saying, look, we're still here. I think anyone who hasn't seen poetry before as this kind of essential part of existence will really be able to appreciate in this poem that it can be essential. It can be about just still being alive, and that is in itself an act of resistance. Poetry has long been dominated by white male voices, of course, and yet Lucille Clifton is using this form in order to say, you will not stop me. And I love that kind of rebellion. I love rebellion through poetry itself. I love it when writers subvert structure or form or any kind of metaphor or cliche in order to say, no, you cannot make me follow the rules, I will do things my way regardless of what you want me to do. And this poem is just spectacular. I'm sure you don't need me to say that. The next poem is Good Bones by Maggie Smith, and no, not that Maggie Smith. Another Maggie Smith, a Maggie Smith who is a poet. This is, I believe, another sonnet. It's been a little while since I've read this one, but I think I first saw it because the YouTuber and writer and director Hazel Hayes shared it on her Instagram story. I love Hazel Hayes and I love the things she shares on her Insta, and so I read this poem and just went, ooh yeah, this one feels good. This is a poem about your life message, really, about what it is you would choose to pass on to your children. It is about finding your ways to enjoy existence. It's about building the life that you want to live, and then sharing the secret to how you build the life you want to live, rather than the life that you should want to live, to the people who are still making up their minds, to children, to people who don't know what they're doing. It feels to me so communally feminine, this idea that we're all still figuring things out, that the world isn't so easy for us to carve our way into it, but that we can do it. We have good bones to our life. We can build something living around that skeleton. And I think it is just a really, really interesting poem from that aspect of discussing life as this thing that actually is really quite special to get to share, and that the secret is just to love it. And I also like that it takes something akin to a sonnet, a very rigid structure, and is all about breaking the rules again, about doing what it is you want to do, regardless of what people say perhaps you should want to, and saying, it's okay, we're all allowed to do that. The next poem is Scaffolding by Seamus Heaney. Yes, a poem by a man, by a very, very well-known male poet. I'm terribly sorry to have to do it to you. But this poem is just so clever that I feel like I have to bring it up, not least because in that Instagram thread people were saying they need the poems that give them that feeling on the inside to make it worth reading, and they haven't read poems that give them that gut reaction, that gut feeling that poetry is meant to give you. So I went for a more emotional poem, regardless of how simple it was, because I think that is the kind of poem that is really, really good for getting people into reading more of it. If you realise that poetry can be so tender and beautiful, even while being simplistic and easy to understand, then you're far more likely to go looking for that kind of poetry, and you are much better equipped to be able to find it. Scaffolding is about trusting someone to take care of you, about putting the work into a relationship to make sure that relationship will survive, and about trusting that other person as you build this relationship around the two of you, as you continue to grow and rebuild yourselves as people. It is such a short poem. I think it is only 8 lines long, put into 4 couplets, and 6 of those lines are on building the metaphor, and it is only in those final 2 lines that it is explained in the context of this is about a relationship, this is about trusting each other and building something beautiful between the two of us. And I think it is just really, really sweet and very, very true. I feel like a lot of poetry, particularly the sentimental, gut-wrenching romantic poetry, is often involved in codependent or unhealthy or obsessive or toxic relationships, and as much as I love reading that stuff, sometimes you just want to hear about people taking care of each other and being good to each other and building a healthy relationship that you know will last, because you can build it up and then you can take the scaffolding down. The next poem on my list is You're by Sylvia Plath. Now, when I was making this list, I was there going, which Sylvia Plath poem do I put in? Because I'm a basic bitch. I love Sylvia Plath. I think for now she is my favourite poet. She is just, well, she was such an honest, raw, openly feminine and grieving and hurting confessional poet, and I deeply admire the way she writes and the ways that she subverted every kind of norm and expectation placed on women writers when she was writing. And this poem is very, very different to a lot of what she writes, but I adore it because of it. You're is about her first impression when she looked at her baby for the first time. It is just a list of similes and metaphors and this beautiful, alive language that comes alive as you read it, and you can feel it sort of moving in your head as you go through each word and the shape and the sound of the syllables. There's actually a really good poem about that style of writing by Carol Ann Duffy called Gambling, which I would highly recommend, but that's not on this list. It's just a beautiful, touching poem by a mother about her child, and it fills me with glee. It's one of the poems that I'm putting in the middle of this because we're now starting to get into more interpretive poems where you need to start thinking through what words they're using and the ways they're building a message through these words. But I think more than anything the message with this poem is that Sylvia just loves her baby, that it is about the joy of looking at a child and so many thoughts racing through your head, but they're all just curious and loving and caring. This isn't as straightforward as the other poems that I've put in this list, but really it doesn't take a huge amount of thought to get everything you need out of the poem. You can just let the images of all the metaphors and the similes wash over you and just enjoy the sound and the feeling of the words. I think that's one of the best things to do as you start to explore poetry, is you don't always have to find a deeper meaning. You can just let it wash over you. You can enjoy poetry just for the sound of it, just for the way the words fit together, for the fact that it sounds right, if nothing else. And this is a really, really good poem for that, I think. You can just enjoy how it sounds, how it feels to be reading it, and to enjoy the language that Sylvia has put together like this. The next poem on this list is Goodbye by Alan Lewis. Again, another male poet. I'm terribly sorry. But we can approve this one because it is a husband talking to his wife before he leaves for war. It is tender, it is touching, it is beautiful, and again, this is one that I studied in class, this time at A level as we were going through unseen poetry, and we really, really spent a lot of a lesson on this one because it is so beautiful. This is one where it might be worth taking some time to go through each line and think about the images that are conjured from each word choice and from the narrative of the husband and wife getting ready for bed until the end of the poem. But it is just tender and sweet and loving and longing, and it really hurt me the first time I read it. I was there just going, oh ouch. ooh, no, please be okay, you two. But really, all you need is to know that this is a poem of longing and love, and I think really you can pick up so much of that just from the sound of it without even having to worry about the nitpicky close meaning of each line and word choice. So recommend this one. It's soft. On the same theme of love poems, the next poem is You Therefore by Reginald Shepherd. This is one that I found on the Poetry Foundation website because they do a poem for the day, which I have been reading pretty much every day since January as a way to just get more poetry into my life. This was the poem that they chose for Valentine's Day, and I'm so pleased about that. The acknowledgement at the top of the poem tells you that this is a poem from a man to a man. This is a gay love poem, and that makes me very, very happy that they chose it for Valentine's Day, because God, we've all heard Shakespeare's sonnets, we all know the poems they read at weddings. We need some more interesting, diverse love poetry, and that's what this is. It is not cliched at all, but it is familiar just in the ways it details the love from Reginald to his lover, from the ways it talks about his lover and their relationship and the affection that he feels for him. It's just adorable, and it makes me feel so happy to read about, again, healthy, happy love, the way that it is and the way that we all want it to be. This is just sweet, lovely poetry. I feel like there's so much poetry that has to be seen as gritty or cynical or giving a hot take on life and reality, but poetry can just be lovely. It can just be sweet and romantic and heartfelt, and that's all that matters, really, is that it feels good to be reading it. Even if it is a poem that gets in touch with hard emotions, what matters is that it feels good, and sometimes you need feel-good poetry. So I've put that in here to say you can like soppy stuff, you can like romantic stuff. It doesn't have to be hard for you to enjoy it. And now we get on to the two final poems that I am recommending, and I deliberately made the choice to recommend these poems because I don't understand them both fully. And that was very intentional. As I say, I was recommending these in a comment thread under an Instagram post to someone who said they don't get poetry, but that they want to. And so I am saying, as a lover of poetry, as a poet myself, as someone who adores analysing poetry, that I don't understand all poetry. In fact, I don't understand most poetry. And so I picked these two poems deliberately because I still love them, even though I don't quite understand everything they say or everything they're trying to say. And the first poem for that is ProFemina by Caroline Kaiser. This is pro-feminine. This is feminist. It was written in the early 2000s. It is very second wave feminism. It is very righteous and angry and indignant, but with such a level of control and power through the way that Caroline Kaiser writes. I really enjoyed it, mostly just because of that feeling of force pushing through the poem. She's writing in a very, very complex way, which is why I don't understand it all, is because there are so many sounds dumb, but there are so many words, and I couldn't quite unpick all of them. But that didn't matter. I got the overall feeling of the poem, and I liked it, and I like that I can spend a long time reading and rereading this one until I fully get it. But that hasn't stopped me from saying, yeah, this is a poem I really, really love. Again, I'm recommending it because it is feminist, aggressively pro-feminine, against the patriarchy. It is about smashing down those barriers, those things that limit women, and in particular, that limit female creativity. This poem is broken up into sections, and so it initially talks about the different waves of feminism in effect, but then goes into talking about the ways that all of these layers of patriarchy limit female expression and creativity, and the ways that you can fight back against it, and I think it's awesome. The wording did trip me up a fair bit as I was reading it, and it took me a fair while to just go, you know what, I don't need to try and understand this, I can just let myself be carried by the voice of this. And I think that's another really, really good practice, is just imagine it's a body of water, just let yourself float with it, let yourself be taken along, and let yourself misunderstand, let yourself not get it, because that's fine. And then finally on my list is Iowa Blues Bar Spiritual by Juan Felipe Herrera. Again, I have no idea what this poem means. This is one that was on the Poetry Foundation Poem for the Day ages ago when I looked at it on a whim, and it's a long poem. It's written in really, really long couplets, and I have no clue what it means. My guess is it's some kind of ode to Iowa, particularly to a Latina community there in some capacity, but I genuinely have no clue what it means, what its purpose is, or why Herrera wrote it. But all I know is that reading it, I felt swept up in the language. It's another poem that just felt alive while I was reading it. I felt like I was being carried along by the words, like they were some beautiful music that I couldn't help dancing to. And so I'm recommending it because I think it's just so stunning in the way that it could do that for me. Even though I didn't understand it, the fact that it could do that shows what an impressive, clever, musical, lyrical poem it is. And I really, really like it. I reread it semi-frequently because it's just, it feels like a magical experience to be reading it. And so that is why it is my final recommendation, because I genuinely have no clue what this poem means. All I know is that it feels good to be reading it, and so I want to recommend it in the hope that it feels good to you to read it. So there you have it. There are my 10 poems from beginner to even I don't know what they mean. I hope that this video in some way encourages you to read maybe just one of these poems and to see what it does for you or to you, or what it can make you think. Because I think poetry is just one of the most beautiful things that exists, and it feels like such a shame to me that patriarchy and intellectualism have ruined what is such a beautiful way for humans to express themselves and to communicate with others. I think there is nothing that stops anyone from enjoying a poem. I think it is simply a case of you haven't found the right poem yet, which is a horrible heterosexual saying, but if you haven't read anything by someone of your identities, whatever they are, racial, religious, sexual, gender-based, find someone from that community who writes. It may take some digging if they're not straight, white and male, but you will find them. Because everyone from every community has someone who writes, has someone that communicates these experiences. If you're someone who has been through certain experiences, there will be poems about that kind of experience, be it positive or negative, and you will be able to find people who have reflected your voice in their writing, or who show you a new way of thinking and looking at it. It's an indescribable feeling when you hit a poem that just makes you go, God, this is so perfect and it's so right. And I wish everyone could experience that feeling. Not least because I am someone who loves analysing poetry. I have always loved sitting down in a classroom and picking apart a poem, going through it line by line by line and taking every single aspect of it apart until we've got down to what we think is the exact thing that the poet had in their head as they were writing, and we think, by God, we've got it. We understand this, and look at how cleverly they've put it together. It's like taking apart a clock and looking at all the mechanisms and how it makes this beautiful, alive, ticking thing. And there you go, there's my nerdy ramble. I promised you some bonus reading at the end, so I have 3 poems that I will recommend you as my final parting ones. As an excessively long poem that again has no meaning, and even academics have no idea exactly what this poem means, so you know you're onto a winner. It is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. I want to do a reading of this one day just because it is such an insane, creative, stream of consciousness poem, and I think it is marvellous. I just really, really like it, and I read it a lot, like a lot. Then I want to recommend, as a classic of the online dark academia literary appreciation community, a Richard Sykin poem, because everyone seems to love Richard Sykin to some degree, because he takes very relatable feelings about love and jealousy and sex and relationships and turns them into bitter, often colloquial, slang-filled poems. And so I want to recommend the one poem of his that I have read so far, which was recommended to me by one of the people that I sent my list of recommendations to in response, and that is Litany, in which certain things are crossed out, because it just made me achy in my chest in a good way. It gave me feelings, and that's all I ask for with poems. And then finally, this is a poem that once I realised what it was about, and I was helped on that way because the Poetry Foundation had put together an educational package on what this poem means, but when it hit me, it was a gut punch, and I think about this poem a lot. Like, I didn't think I liked it at first. I thought, that's cool, but I'm not going to dwell on this, but now I think about it pretty frequently. It's called Sea Creature Regrows Its Entire Body, and I will tell you what it's about now just so that you can have that gut punch feeling. It's about domestic abuse and leaving an abusive situation, and oh my god, when you read this poem realising that, it is an incredibly grounding experience, and I think it is phenomenal. So there you have it. Thank you so much for letting me ramble about poetry, and I really hope that this encourages you to give poetry a go. Again, perhaps. But just to let it take you for a little bit, to give yourself to it, and to trust that someone has written something that will make you feel really intensely. It will be out there, and I hope that at the very least this is a starting point of encouragement, of confidence for people who feel like they can't understand poetry, or that it's just not meant for them. It is. Poetry is meant to be for everyone. Look into slam poetry, look into live readings, look into performance arts, look into student films and explorative media in any way. You will find your way to like poetry. It just might take a bit more digging. But I really hope that this sets people onto a path of adoring poetry, and I really want to talk more about poetry because it is one of my most favourite things. So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like this video if you like it, and comment down below. If you read any of these poems I recommended, let me know what you think, and if you've read them all, or if you're a seasoned expert in poetry, or if you love poetry, just tell me about some of your favourite poems, because I always want to read more poetry. Please subscribe if you would like to see more of my bookish content, and I will see you next time. It is just a really good, yeah, just end your sentence there. It might be for the best.